let's find out a bit about him. So as you can see in this app, we have all the portraits of the different kings and queens going along the top. And as I pull them along, you can see the royal line of succession moves along at the same time. We are going to start with William I. There he is. And his successor, William II. So William the Conqueror. Let's read more. Sir William lived from circa 1027, and he died on the 9th of September 1087. He reigned from the 14th of October 1066 to the 9th of September, when he died, obviously, 1087. William sailed over the Channel, that's the English Channel, to take the throne of England. At the Battle of Hastings he proved himself worthy of the name Conqueror. Better than that, he went on to prove he could do more than just conquer a country, but that he could organise it too, and did so with the epic Domesday Book. William the Conqueror may have been a foreigner to England, but he became one of the most best-known English kings of all time, and the ancestor of all the kings and queens to follow, right up to our present-day Queen, Elizabeth II. William claimed that Edward the Confessor had promised the crown of England to him, and as such he marched, sailed right over from France to claim it. Whether he was telling the truth about Edward's promise, we'll never know, because after his victory over Harold II at the famous Battle of Hastings, he became king. He was crowned king at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in 1066. it says, you'll notice that this happens a lot. So upon the death of William the Conqueror, the crown fell to another William, known as Rufus, or the Red King, possibly because of his red hair or ruddy face. Outspoken William II was never particularly popular. He offended the church by spending its money on himself and exiling its archbishop when the two men disagreed. He offended almost everyone else with his swearing and the scandalous nature of his court, where flowing hair and extravagant dress, not to mention outrageously pointy shoes, were all the fashion. William II invaded Normandy twice, while his brother Robert was supposedly ruling there. In the end, Robert sold Normandy to William II to pay for his place on the First Crusade. It was in William II's reign, therefore, that Normandy first became part of England. Awkward end. William II was out hunting in the New Forest on the 2nd of August 1100, when he saw a stag and began to chase it, followed by his knights. He fired an arrow but missed the stag and called upon his knight, Walter Tyrrell, to shoot. Tyrrell did shoot the king. This was supposedly an accident, but given that the king's brother and heir, Henry, was amongst the party and apparently rode straight off to Winchester to present himself as the new king, the whole business seems mysterious, to say the least. Okay, so then we have Henry I. Here he is. Or Beauclerc. Henry I lived 1068 to the 1st of December 1135. He reigned the 2nd of August 1100 to the 1st of December 1135. Henry was known as the Lion of Justice, an energetic, decisive and occasionally cruel ruler. He defeated his own brother Robert in battle, taking Normandy for England, after which he kept peace in England for 33 years. Sadly, he lost his sons William and Richard to a shipwreck in 1120 and supposedly never smiled again. Henry I grabbed the throne as quickly as possible after his elder brother, William II, was killed, making sure his troublesome brother, Robert, Duke of Normandy, didn't beat him to it. He had the same problems with his rebellious brother, Robert, as William II had before him, and eventually, egged on by some of Robert's own subjects, Henry invaded Normandy. At the Battle of Tinchebray in France, he finally beat Robert for good and went on to keep his brother prisoner for the rest of his life. Normandy was now completely under English rule. Henry married Edith, the daughter of Malcolm III, King of the Scots, in a clever move which won the friendship of the Scots. Edith was also descended from the Anglo-Saxon king Edmund II, or Edmund Ironside, and the marriage therefore reinforced the line of Saxon blood. The queen was renamed Matilda in honour of Henry's own mother. The couple went on to keep up the line of royal Matildas by giving their eldest daughter the same name. In 1120, Henry's two sons, William and Richard, were crossing the English Channel in a boat named the White Ship, when the boat hit a rock and sank, sadly drowning both the princes and nearly everyone English monarch had held so far. England, Wales, later Ireland, Normandy, Anjou from his father, Brittany and Aquitaine from his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and started to repair the damage done by the years of civil war. Henry was a handsome, fierce, passionate and energetic ruler with a famously ferocious temper. He was always fighting, hunting, was just 22 and went on to become a hero of the Crusades. As a young man, he was also involved in rebellions against his father, Henry II, supported by his forceful mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and in league with King Philip of France. Richard grew up in Aquitaine and was probably his mother's favourite son, but like his older brother, Henry, the young king, he just didn't get on with his father. When Henry II died, it was said that his nose bled in Richard's presence, a sure sign that Richard was responsible for his death. Richard did come to England for his coronation at Westminster Abbey, but immediately afterwards started his preparations for the Third Crusade. This was a fight against the Muslim forces of Saladin, who were controlling the city of Jerusalem. On his way to the Crusades, Richard married Berengaria, daughter of the King of Navarre. Things started well for Richard and the other Christian leaders of the Third Crusade, but before long they were all squabbling amongst themselves. In the end, neither side was making any real progress, so the Crusaders were forced to make a truce with Saladin. By this time, Richard was anxious to get home, as he knew the King of France and his own baby brother John were plotting against him. But luck had turned against Richard, and on his way home, his ship was wrecked. Forced to travel across land, Richard entered the territory of Duke Leopold of Austria. Duke Leopold wasn't Richard's biggest fan, as Richard had been rude to him while they were all fighting in the Holy Land, so he had him captured and thrown into prison. Richard was stuck in prison for 15 months. When he was finally released, he quickly returned to England, where he found his younger brother John had been spending all the royal money and planning to take the throne. Richard didn't have much time to hang about in England, however, as his overseas lands were once again under threat. He had to cross the Channel yet again. While fighting in Limousin, France, in 1199, Richard was hit in the shoulder by an arrow. He pretended it was nothing and kept fighting for another couple of days. But then the wound started to fester. In the end, it wasn't the arrow, but the infection which killed the Lionheart. Richard was buried at Fontevraud Abbey, beside his father, although the heart of the lion was taken out and buried separately at Rouen. When Richard I was imprisoned by Duke Leopold of Austria, no one knew where he was. According to legend, one of his most faithful minstrels, named Blondel, wandered across Europe singing a song that he and the king had composed together. After months of wandering and singing, Blondel eventually passed under Richard's window and heard the king's voice as he joined in with the song. He had discovered the location of the Lionheart. And next we have John the Lackland. John lived between the 24th of December 1166 and the 19th of October 1216. He reigned from the 6th of April 1199 to the 19th of October 1216. A bit of a disaster as a king, John annoyed his parents so much that they made him sign an agreement called Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, protecting the rights of the people against the wishes of the king and changing the course of English history. This did nothing to help save French territories, however, which were lost under John's rule. And the other thing some sons, and nicknamed Lackland because he was the only one who grew up without his own region to rule. After his elder brothers Henry and Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, died, and while Richard I was off fighting in the Third Crusade, John started plotting to take the crown for himself, even declaring himself king when Richard was in prison. Richard found out, but John managed to charm his way out of trouble. This didn't last long, however. Richard died, and John did actually become king, and what a rotten king he was. He was weak, greedy, and selfish. It was during John's reign that England lost nearly all her land in France. He messed up so badly that his barons rebelled and brought in the son of the King of France to try and take John's place, but before this could happen, John died of a fever. John was a disaster as a king. The barons eventually got so annoyed that in 1215 they drew up a long document called Magna Carta, setting out all the rights of Englishmen and the duties of the king. John wasn't totally happy about this, as it restricted many of his powers as king, but the barons forced him to sign it. When John became king, he wasn't technically first in line to the throne. This should have been his nephew Arthur, who was the son of John's elder brother Geoffrey, but Arthur was just a little boy, and Richard chose John to succeed him. When Arthur reached his teens, however, he started getting hungry for the throne. He imprisoned his grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, in order to start a war with John. John wasn't so useless that he couldn't beat a 15-year-old boy. He captured Arthur and had him murdered. John was impatient and not at all sensible. When travelling from Norfolk to Lincolnshire with all of his servants and royal possessions, he ordered his party to cross the Wash without checking the tide first. The tide came in and swept away all John's treasures. The crown jewels were lost to the sea forever. And next we have Henry III. Here he is. He lived from the 1st of October 1207 to the 16th of November 1272, and he reigned from the 19th of October 1216 to the 16th of November 1872. Henry was just 9 years old when his father, John, died and left him the throne. He was his father's son, in other words, not the greatest of kings. The barons, always easily annoyed, went so far as to organise a rebellion and capture Henry. However, Henry had a son, Edward, who was a rather more successful leader and who saved his father, allowing Henry to get back on the throne, where he stayed until the end of his days. Luckily, Henry III had some good advisers who kept the young king and the country on the straight and narrow until Henry was old enough to rule on his own. Unfortunately, it turned out Henry wasn't very good at ruling on his own, just like his father. He managed to really annoy the barons all over again, and was forced into an agreement called the Provisions of Oxford, which said Henry had to take the advice of a council of barons. The leader of the barons was this was an idea that survived through many reigns to come. Henry also rebuilt Westminster Abbey to honour Edward, housing the saint's bones in a shrine, which you can still see today. So, we're going to leave it there. But, next, we'll start with Edward the First. So, did we look at today? William the First, William the Second, Henry the First, Stephen, Henry the Second, Richard the First, John, and Henry the Third. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers saying I shall see you very, very soon. Bye bye for now. Bye bye. Hello everybody. This is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and this is part 2 of my look at the kings and queens of England. So we're going to use these flashcards and this app on my iPad. So, what did we look at in the last video? We took a look at William the Conqueror, William the Second, Henry the First, Stephen, Henry the Second, Richard the First, John, and Henry the Third. So now we're going to take a look at Edward the First, Edward Longshanks. And here is his card. Here he is. So Edward the First lived between the 17th of June 1239 and the 7th of July 1307, and he reigned between the 16th of November 1272 to the 7th of July 1307. Edward was a good king. He learned harsh lessons from the mess made by his father, Henry III, and used them to become a strong and fair ruler. He worked hard to bring about peace with the barons, and his fighting achievements in the Battle of Evesham, and then later in the Crusades, gained him reputation as a fearsome warrior. Powerful, clever, fierce and ambitious for himself and his country, Edward left a legacy of law and order. When Edward was still a young prince, his father, Henry III, got himself into a civil war with the barons, led by Edward's godfather, Simon de Montfort. Edward fought on Henry's side, but was captured and held hostage after de Montfort won the Battle of Lewes. But Edward was cunning and escaped in May 1265 whilst on a hunting trip. Clearly he wasn't having too hard a time as a hostage. Edward's return to Henry's system. He also built lots of castles, including Carnarvon in Wales. Edward made sure everyone knew he was in charge. Edward was a giant for his times, 1.9 metres or 6 feet 2 inches tall. His impressive height named him the nickname Longshanks. Military might. As a young prince, Edward had done the usual medieval gap year and joined the Crusades. There wasn't much fighting for him to do, but he did manage to escape an assassination attempt by one of the original assassins, an order of Shia Muslims. Following the death of his father, Edward returned to England to find himself king. In his new role, he decided to take on his neighbours, Wales and Scotland. Edward fought Llewellyn, Ab Gruffydd, Prince of Gwynedd, and eventually the Welsh prince was defeated and killed. Edward then named his own son, the Prince of Wales. Every first son of the monarch has been called the Prince of Wales since then. Edward then turned his attention to Scotland and earned the nickname Hammer of the Scots. He even stole the Stone of Scone, an important symbol of Scottish kingship, and had it taken down to London. It didn't return to Scotland until 1996. Scotland just wouldn't go quietly, however, and Edward was still waging battles in the north when he died in 1307. In 1254, at the age of 15, Edward had travelled to Spain to marry 9-year-old Eleanor of Castile. Edward grew to love his wife dearly. When she died in 1290, he was heartbroken. He had her body carried in a procession from Lincoln to Westminster, and a large cross put up at every place the procession stopped, 12 in total, including Charing Cross in London. You can see a copy of the final memorial cross outside Charing Cross station today. Okay, and then we go on to Edward the Second. Edward II lived between the 25th of April 1284 and the 21st of September 1327, and he reigned between the 8th of July 1307 to the 20th of January 1327. Edward II might have been a handsome man, but he didn't inherit any of his father, Edward I's impressive leadership skills. He surrounded himself with close favourites rather than sensible advisers, and those who weren't his favourites were less than happy. The result of this diverse ruling style was a civil war, and then Edward's own wife, Isabella, launched an invasion, forcing the king to give up the throne to his son. Edward II gave his number one favourite, Piers Gaveston, title and lands, without Gaveston having done anything to deserve them, and this infuriated the English barons. They wrote early start to a reign, but Edward handled it well. He let the rebels rule for a little while, and then, after 3 years, decisively took power into his own hands. He executed the ambitious Mortimer and arrested his mother. Edward turned out to be a mighty force. He set up a court celebrating chivalry. Knights were now expected to be well-behaved gentlemen, protectors of the weak and brave, rescuers of damsels in distress. To make sure everyone understood the new rules, Edward held lots of jousting tournaments and festivals at Windsor Castle. These tournaments weren't just for fun, however. They also helped to train up young knights to join the king's army. Edward and his knights won many battles, but battles are expensive, and Edward's luck began to turn. First his wife, Philippa of Hainaut, and then his brilliant son, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, died. The king ended up enchanted by a much younger mistress, while about him the country fell apart, nearly destroyed by the Black Death. Edward's reign lasted 50 years, and while it wasn't all a bed of roses, he was remembered as a great king for many centuries afterwards. As his mother had been a French princess, and his uncle, the King of France, had died without an heir, Edward III tried to claim that he should be the new ruler of France. Helped by his brave son, the Black Prince, Edward won big victories at the battles of Crécy and Poitiers, and the conquest of Calais. This was largely thanks to the skills of English longbowmen. Edward didn't quite win France, though. In fact, these battles were just the beginning of a war that would turn out to be over a century long, the 100 Years' War. Edward III's mother He was crowned king when he was just 10, and apart from one high point, when he faced down the peasants' revolt aged 14, things didn't go too well for Richard. Richard's reign started well. When he was just 14, he bravely handled the peasants' revolt. This was a group of rebels led by Wat Tyler, who were protesting against higher taxes and all-round rotten treatment. When they reached London, the young king rode out to meet them. There was a fight, and the Lord Mayor of London killed Wat Tyler before the rebels could fight back, which would have led to many more deaths. Richard stepped forward and called out, "I am your leader, follow me." The rebels, rather impressed, left without any more violence, although unfortunately government troops later caught up with and executed many of the rebels. The king was later forced by his council to take back many of his promises and pardons. As Richard grew up, things really started to go downhill. He must have been sick of all his councillors and uncles, of which he had quite a number, ordering him around, and so he became a bossy and demanding young man, preferring to his chosen but unpopular favourites over his older advisers. For many years, Richard's uncle, Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, held much of the power at court. In 1388, a group of lords, headed by Gloucester, held the Merciless Parliament, in which they sentenced many of the king's friends and favourites to death. Richard didn't have much choice but to give in to his advisers. Parliament had threatened to knock him off the throne if he didn't. Although the next few years were relatively peaceful, Richard waited and his anger stewed. Revenge on his enemies came years later, in 1397. He had the leaders of the Merciless Parliament arrested and executed or banished. Banishment was the punishment chosen for the son of Richard's powerful old uncle, John of Gaunt. When Gaunt then died, Richard took over his lands, instead of letting them pass to Gaunt's exiled son, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke was furious, and when Richard went off to try and sort out problems in Ireland, Henry invaded England in order to reclaim his father's inheritance, winning support among much of the nobility in the process. Richard returned to find his country turned against him. He surrendered without a fight. Everyone else seemed to agree that Bolingbroke should now be king, so Richard ended up giving up the throne completely and being imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. Henry Bolingbroke was now Henry IV, and the House of Lancaster had begun. Richard II might not have been the greatest ruler, but as a patron of the arts, he was one of the best. Richard transformed the Norman-built Westminster Hall into the building we see today, now the oldest parliamentary building in England. He was also a patron of the great medieval poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, and he ordered the painting of the Wilton Diptych, which is now in the National Gallery, London. This means that today you can visit a place, read a book, or see a wonderful work of art that were all created during the reign of Richard II. We don't so many supporters that Richard just gave in. But Henry then spent the whole of his reign worrying that someone was going to take the throne from him, and they certainly tried. Stressed out by rebellion, Henry ruled for 14 tough years. He was a good king, however, and no rebellion succeeded. Henry Bolingbroke, named after the castle where he was born, was the son of John of Gaunt and the cousin of Richard II. Not a man with an especially strong claim to be the king, you might think. After all, Richard had lots of other cousins, but Richard wasn't doing a very good job of ruling, and one of his biggest mistakes was to really annoy his cousin Henry. It all started when Henry got into a fight with the Duke of Norfolk. They were about to sort out their argument the old-fashioned way, with swords, when the king stepped in and banished them both from England. Henry went to Paris and was living there when he heard that his father, John of Gaunt, had died back home. This was bad enough, but there was more. Richard had taken all John of Gaunt's land for himself, instead of leaving it for Henry when he got back. Enough was enough. Henry secretly returned to England while Richard was away in Ireland. Many nobles were fed up with Richard, so they joined Henry. Richard came back to find his country, his enemies and his supporters had all switched over to Henry. The king didn't have much say in the matter. He handed over the crown on the 29th of September, 1399, and the reign of Henry IV began. It wasn't a very happy reign. Having seized the crown for himself, Henry was now worried someone else would do the same to him. Rebellions popped up left, right and centre, and although none of them were successful, they made controlling the country pretty hard work. People were also unhappy with the way things were done in the church. It was during Henry's reign that the first person in England was burned at the stake because of his religious ideas. One of the people Henry executed was the Archbishop of York, who supported rebellions against the king. Most people thought killing a bishop was about as evil as you could get, not to mention the suspicious death in prison of the king, Richard, just a few months after Henry took the throne. Henry's stressful reign took its toll on his health. The king died aged only 48 after ruling for just 14 years. In spite of all those troubles, Henry had managed to keep the country together for his son, Henry V. Because Henry IV's claim to the throne was a little shaky, lots of people tried to take it from him. He had to fight off rebellions from the Welsh, the Scots and his fellow Englishmen. One of the English rebels was Sir Henry Percy, known as Harry Hotspur. The king's forces met Harry's at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. Harry had had a new coat of arms designed for himself, and all of Harry's men would have known to look out for it. So the king had some of his soldiers dress up in his opponent's coat of arms to confuse the enemy. It worked. Harry Hotspur was defeated and the king lived to keep his throne. Henry once heard a prophecy that he would die in Jerusalem. Great, thought the king. I'm not going there any time soon. But when Henry suddenly fell ill while praying in Westminster Abbey, he was carried into a room called the Jerusalem Chamber. He opened his eyes and asked where he was. Jerusalem, came the reply, and after thanking God, Henry promptly died, just as the prophecy was at least 4 times bigger. And now we go on to Henry VI. Henry VI lived between the 6th of December 1421 and the 21st of May 1471. He reigned between the 31st of August 1422, the 4th of March 1461 and the 3rd of October 1470 and the 11th of April 1471. Henry VI became king, aged only 8 months when his father, Henry V, died in France. As he grew up, it appeared that Henry VI was not a well man. Some people thought he shouldn't be king, others wanted to rule on his behalf. This squabbling started the Wars of the Roses. All Henry wanted was peace, but his fierce wife and his enemies wouldn't let him be. When Henry V died in France, Henry VI became king. It transpired that he suffered from some kind of psychological disorder, just like his grandfather, the Mad King of France. Henry V's cousin, Richard, Duke of York, was next in line to the throne, and therefore, when Henry fell ill, Richard took charge. When the king appeared to recover, Richard was thrown out by Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, and other members of his Lancaster family. Those people descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Richard and the other Yorkists, those descended from John of Gaunt's brother Edmund, Duke of York, decided that a mad king was no king at all, and that a Yorkist should sit on the throne instead. This started the Wars of the Roses, so called because the symbol of the House of York was a white rose, and the symbol of the House of Lancaster was a red rose. Even when he was in his right mind, poor Henry had no interest in fighting. He liked peace and quiet books and colleges. It was his fierce wife who led his armies against the Yorkist rebels. There were many battles, and important men on both sides were killed, including Richard, Duke of York. Richard's son Edward was now even more determined to take down Henry, and after defeating the royal army had himself declared king in March 1461. Henry and Margaret fled to Scotland, where they stayed for a few years before once again trying to make a comeback. This time, Henry was captured and put into prison. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London for 6 years. In 1417, Henry's supporters, led by the tricksy Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who kept switching sides, put him back onto the throne. It wasn't to last. Just 6 months later, Edward returned and got the throne back for good. This time, Henry's stay in prison wasn't so long. He died, supposedly of pure displeasure and melancholy, but quite possibly by murder. Shortly afterwards, you can see his grave in St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Henry VI founded both Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. Every year on the 21st of May, the day Henry died, people from both Eton and King's still go to the Tower news was probably the same as that of his grandfather, the mad King Charles of France. Charles had begun to believe he was made of glass and couldn't be touched in case he smashed. Henry heard angels singing, and when he was really ill, couldn't recognise people around him, or sometimes even move. He was completely unaware when news was brought to him of the birth of his son. Worst of all, during the Second Battle of St. Albans in 1461, the king laughed and sang in the midst of bitter fighting. But of course, none of this was Henry's fault. He was just sick, and it must have been terrible for him to be thrown into prison and left there to die. So, we are going to leave it there. And next time we will look at more kings and queens. So today we looked at Edward the First, Edward the Second, Edward the Third, Richard the Second, Henry the Fourth, Henry the Fifth, and finally Henry the Sixth. Next time we will begin with Edward the Fourth. Thank you so much for watching and listening. This has been Kate was a secret wedding which caused scandal in the Yorkist court, not least as he gave his wife's family all sorts of important positions at court. Although Richard Neville knocked Edward off the throne temporarily, putting back Henry VI, Edward came back with a vengeance. The second time around, he was a bit better behaved, and people felt like England was getting back on its feet after years of brutal war. But then Edward died, some people say from bad health, due to a little bit too much fun and overindulgence, and the trouble started all over again. Edward IV's younger brother, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, couldn't decide whether he liked his big brother being king or not. At first he supported Edward, then he changed his mind and went over to the side of his father-in-law, the rebellious Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, and tried to overthrow his own brother. When that didn't look like it was going to work out, Neville was killed in battle. George decided that actually he did like his big brother after all, but it was too late. Edward wouldn't forgive his brother and had him executed. The story goes that Edward had George drowned in a barrel of wine. Edward IV couldn't resist a pretty face, and the prettiest of all belonged to a widow 5 years his senior. Elizabeth Woodville, completely head over heels in love, Edward married Elizabeth in secret in 1464. It had to be secret because the king's friends and supporters wanted him to marry a French princess, and Elizabeth wasn't even very high up in the nobility. What was worse, she was a Lancastrian. When the marriage was revealed, Edward's family were fuming, but Edward refused to give up his new queen, and although Edward would go on to chase all sorts of other women, he always came back to his wife, with whom he had 10 children. So let us go to the next king. Now I don't have a card for Edward V, so let's read a bit more. Edward V lived the 2nd of November 1470 to circa 1483. He reigned for a very short time, between the 9th of April 1483 and the 25th of June 1483. When his father, Edward IV, died, Edward V was supposed to become king. However, when he came to the throne, he was just 12 years old and didn't have any powerful friends or advisors. His own uncle Richard put him and his brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, into the Tower of London, and the tragic little princes in the tower were never seen again. Edward V was one of the little princes in the tower, although perhaps he really should have been called the king in the tower. Edward was just a 12-year-old boy when his father, Edward IV, died unexpectedly. With nobody to look after the young heir, a powerful struggle for the throne ensued. Richard III was the youngest son of Richard, Duke of York, and still only a boy of 8 when his elder brother became Edward IV. He loved his big brother, and when he grew older fought bravely and loyally in the Wars of the Roses. Unlike his older brother, George, who kept switching sides. Richard married Anne Neville, the widow of Henry VI's only son, and the daughter of the rebellious Earl of Warwick. This marriage really annoyed his brother George, who had married Anne's sister Isabel, and thought that by doing so he'd inherit all of Warwick's fortune. Now, it was going to be split between him and Richard, and George weren't happy. It was this argument that led people to suspect that Richard helped to execute George by drowning him in a barrel of wine. Then Edward IV died suddenly, and his young son Edward became king. Richard was named Lord Protector of the realm because 12-year-old Edward was really too young to reign. But then people started whispering that Edward IV and his queen, Elizabeth Woodville, weren't properly married, and that meant Edward V wasn't really a king at all, just an ordinary little boy. It also meant that Richard ought to be king, and he lost no time in taking up the crown. Richard was crowned on the 6th of July, 1483. Anne and Richard only had one child, also called Edward, and the young boy died less than a year after his parents' coronation. Anne followed her son to the grave soon after, leaving Richard all alone. A few months later, Henry Tudor, the new star of the House of Lancaster, returned to England with one aim: to take Richard's throne. At the Battle of Bosworth, the king suffered a huge betrayal when 7,000 men all defected to Henry. Richard fought bravely, battling on even when his horse had run off without him, but eventually he was killed by Henry's men. The Wars of the Roses were finally at an end. The Tudors then made sure that everyone remembered Richard as evil. They deformed his figure in portraits and threw away his body. It wasn't found again until 2012, when it was uncovered in a car park in Leicester. And then we got on to Henry VII. Henry VII lived between the 28th of January 1457 and the 21st of April 1509. He reigned between the 22nd of August 1485 and the 21st of April 1509. As the first Tudor king, Lancastrian, Henry defeated his rival, the Yorkist Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth, thereby winning the throne. He cemented his new position by marrying Richard's niece, Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, bringing together the houses of York and Lancaster and ending the Wars of the Roses. Having secured his position as king, Henry VII then had to fight off various impostors who made their own claims to the crown, including Lambert Simnel. Henry made him into a kitchen boy, and Perkin Warbeck, who wasn't so lucky and ended up dead. In order to keep himself safe, Henry set up a personal bodyguard called the Yeoman of the Guard, a team which still exists houses. Henry VII, a great-great-grandson of John of Gaunt and champion of the Lancastrians, finally put an end to all of the fighting when he invaded England and defeated the then King, Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth in Leicestershire. Beating Richard III was not enough to secure him the throne. However, Sir Henry wisely married the Yorkist princess Elizabeth, ending the wars. Henry VII's bride was Elizabeth of York, the eldest surviving child of Edward IV. In spite of the marriage having been arranged between the couple's mothers, Henry felt deeply in love with his wife. It was said that upon her death he wouldn't let anybody come near him. However, Henry was a clever fellow, and his grief may have been tempered by panic that his hard-won crown was once again in danger. His eldest son and heir had died, leaving just one young boy to inherit, and with Elizabeth gone, there was the possibility of having another son. With this in mind, he began looking around for a new wife to take Elizabeth's place. In spite of having united the houses of Lancaster and York, Henry VII and the House of Tudor faced lots of threats. In 1487, some of the old Yorkists presented a young boy who they claimed was the Earl of Warwick, Richard III's nephew and the rightful heir to the throne. In fact, this lad was just an ordinary boy named Lambert Simnel. Henry knew this right away because he had the real Earl of Warwick locked up in the Tower of London. He brought him out for a brief show and tell to prove his point, and then forced Lambert Simnel to work as a servant in the royal kitchens. Another impostor was a chap called Perkin Warbeck. Perkin claimed he was Richard of Shrewsbury, Edward IV's second son, and one of the vanished princes in the Tower. This claim was harder for Henry to dismiss. Perkin led a rebellious invasion supported by the Scots, but was captured and later hanged. Henry VIII. Henry VIII lived between the 28th of June 1491 and the 28th of January 1547. He reigned between the 21st of April 1509 and the 28th of January 1547. Famous for his ginger hair, fiery temper, and many wives, Henry VIII was a big, bold figure in every sense. Accustomed to getting his own way, Henry broke with Pope Clement VII and the Catholic Church in Rome because he wanted a divorce, and created the Church of England, of which he was the supreme head. This marked a dramatic period of change in England known as the English Reformation. Henry was never meant to be king. That was supposed to be the job of his big brother Arthur. When Arthur died prematurely, however, Henry became the heir to the throne. As a young man, he was good-looking, athletic and amidst all of this, his third wife, Jane Seymour, gave birth to a son. However, she sadly died not long after giving birth. To marry his second, Anne Boleyn, Henry asked the Pope to grant him a divorce. The Pope was unwilling to give Henry what he wanted, leaving Henry fuming. He needed his divorce as Anne was already pregnant, and he was sure that she was going to give birth to his future son and heir. To get his divorce, Henry decided to separate the Church of England from the Church in Rome. As part of this separation, known as the English Reformation, Henry also got rid of many of the powerful monasteries across the country, a process known as the dissolution of the monasteries. When young, Henry was considered very attractive, standing at 6 feet 2 inches. He was strikingly tall for the times, strong, sporty and handsome, but Henry's appetite was as big as his ambitions, and as he got older, he also got fatter. A festering wound on his leg from an old jousting accident, which remained untreated and never healed, completed the pretty picture. He died at the age of only 55. Then we go on to Edward VI. He lived between the 12th of October 1537 and the 6th of July 1553, and he reigned between the 28th of January 1547 and the 6th of July 1553. The only son of Henry VIII, Edward VI arrived on the throne at the tender age of 9. Being rather clever, however, he already knew his own mind. He wanted everyone in England to become Protestant. Unluckily for him, his brain was in better shape than his body, and Edward died when he was just 15. Edward VI was the son that Henry VIII had longed for. Coming to the throne at just 9 years old, he initially had a protector to help him, his uncle, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and later Duke of Somerset. The Duke of Somerset was a good soldier, but not everyone liked the fact that he had so much power. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, managed to turn the King's Council against Somerset, and Edward's uncle was beheaded in 1552. The young king appeared unmoved by the execution of his uncle, writing in his diary for that day, "Today the Duke of Somerset had his head cut off on Tower Hill." Edward VI was a Protestant and wanted everyone in England to take on his favoured religion. He insisted that symbols of Catholicism, such as stained glass and statues, were removed from churches. Always quite sickly, Edward died when he was just 15 years old. It was during Edward VI's Protestant reign that the Book of Common Prayer was introduced in England in 1549. This was more than just a new book. Its publication meant that some parts of church services would be conducted in English rather than only in Latin. This was hugely controversial and even provoked rebellion in Cornwall and Devon. The Church of England still uses an updated version of the Book of Common Prayer today. Next in line to the throne after Edward was his big sister Mary, a staunch Catholic. Edward was so worried Jane's claim to the throne came from the fact that she was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII and the first cousin once removed of Edward VI. When Edward VI was dying in June 1553, he actually nominated Jane as his successor, subverting the claims of his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. However, members of the Privy Council changed their minds on this decision once the king had died and proclaimed Mary as Queen on 19th of July 1553. Jane was convicted of high treason in November that year. Although her life was initially spared, later rebellions against Mary I's plans to marry Philip of Spain led to the execution of both Jane and her husband. Okay, so we're going to leave it there, but next time we will start with Mary the First. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers saying, I shall see you very soon. Bye bye for now. Bye bye. Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and this is the fourth part of our exploration into the lives of the kings and queens of England. Today we're going to start with Mary the First. Here she is, the House of Tudor. Mary the First lived between the 18th of February 1516 and the 17th of November 1558. She reigned between the 19th of July 1553 and the 17th of November 1558. Mary the First was the first queen regnant, that is, a queen reigning in her own right, rather than a queen through marriage to a king. Courageous and stubborn, her character was moulded by her early years when she was disowned by her father, Henry VIII, after her parents' divorce. She was a devout Catholic like her mother, Catherine of Aragon, 1603. When Elizabeth I was crowned, she turned the country upside down again, announcing herself as a Protestant queen. She was determined to be as strong as any man, and declared that had the heart and stomach of a king. There was just one problem. Unlike her father, she wasn't going to get married. Instead, she declared herself to be married to England, a marriage that could offer no children, raising the question of who would be her successor. Elizabeth I was dubbed the Virgin Queen and ruler of a golden age for England. She was the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her mother was beheaded when she was still a baby, and little Elizabeth grew up away from court, never expecting that she would one day become queen. When her father died, followed by her two siblings, Edward and Mary, only Elizabeth was left to rule. Elizabeth didn't force anyone to be Catholic or to be Protestant, although this didn't stop Catholics trying to overthrow her in favour of Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth's cousin. Elizabeth had her rival imprisoned for 19 years before finally having her executed over yet another Catholic plot. The Queen was determined to be as strong as any man, and after her navy saw off the Spanish Armada, few people doubted her power. However, Elizabeth remained unmarried and childless. When she died after a long and brilliant reign, the throne went to James I, the son of her old rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, and the age of the Tudors was over. Elizabeth had been so popular with her subjects, however, that the date of her accession was marked by a national holiday for another 200 years. Spain very quickly forgot the alliance that it had formed with England when Elizabeth I's predecessor, Mary I, was married to the Spanish king Philip II. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was sent to attack England, a great fleet of around 130 ships manned by tens of thousands of fighters. Elizabeth made a heroic speech to her troops as they prepared to defend the coast, saying, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." England's navy was one of the best in Europe, and not to be beaten easily. In fact, aided by typical bad English weather, the clash was an out-and-out victory for England. Spain lost almost half her ships and thousands of men, and was forced to retreat in chaos. Elizabeth I's reign was considered by many as a golden age. She was a cultured and intelligent woman, not to mention a smart politician, and the length and relative stability of her reign were a relief to the buffeted English. The period saw the rise of writers such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and Sir Philip Sidney, and art and music flourished. Daring explorers such as Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh sailed the world in England's name, with Raleigh even naming a newly claimed part of America after the Virgin Queen, Virginia. Raleigh also brought exciting discoveries of tobacco and potatoes back from America. This was the first time these now common products had been seen in England. Elizabeth I was considered James VI of Scotland from the age of just 13 months. Not everyone was happy with him becoming King of England, however, particularly the once again persecuted Catholics. Before long, Guy Fawkes and his gang were plotting to blow up the king and his parliament. James was the Scot who started the Stuarts. Cue gunpowder, treason, and plot. Being King of Scotland hadn't saved James from a stressful childhood. His father had been murdered shortly after James's birth, possibly at the request of his mother. His mother had been exiled and then imprisoned, before finally being executed when James was 20. James I wasn't a bad king, but his insistence on the divine right of kings and his tendency to choose favourites at court didn't make him popular with Parliament. He also liked expensive things and didn't like Parliament interfering with royal money. As a result, England's finances got into a bit of a mess. However, some of the things James spent money on would be well worth it. He employed the famous architect Inigo Jones to build the spectacular banqueting house at Whitehall, London, which you can still visit today. Shakespeare also performed at James's court with his company, the King's Men. James was keen on witch hunting, so keen in fact that before he came to England he wrote a book called Demonology, about these detestable slaves of the devil. James had married a Danish princess, Anne, and when they were sailing back to Scotland, their ship was hit by terrible storms. James believed that this was the work of witches. Many witches were then arrested in Scotland, and so Charles was put on trial by Parliament. He was found guilty of treason and was the first and last executed monarch. During his reign, Charles needed money badly, and Parliament wouldn't give it to him, so he started taxing the English people in all sorts of ways. He began by fining anyone who went into a royal forest, for example, and then he started fining people who went into areas that just used to be royal forests. Unsurprisingly, his subjects were pretty furious. Charles I's execution was on a chilly January day. He insisted on wearing 2 shirts so that he wouldn't shiver. He didn't want the crowds to think he was shaking with fear. His dignity in the face of death impressed many witnesses. Charles I was a hugely important patron of the arts. He asked the Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens to paint the ceiling of the banqueting house in Whitehall, London, a magnificent work of art which can still be seen today. And he collected works from most of the major artists of the day. Anthony van Dyck was an artist at the court of Charles I, and some of his most impressive paintings were commissioned by the king and are still part of the royal collection today. And next we have Charles II. He lived between the 29th of May 1630 and the 6th of February 1685, and he reigned between the 29th of May 1660 and the 6th of February 1685. Charles II was only 12 when the English Civil War broke out. He fought a little in his teens, but was then forced to flee to Europe. He became king at the age of 30. His reign was known as the Restoration, and it saw the country coming back to life after years of war and the Puritan interregnum. It wasn't all fun and flirting, however. Charles's reign also saw the Great Plague, is now home to the Chelsea pensioners. And now we go on to James II. He lived between the 14th of October 1633 and the 16th of September 1701, and he reigned between the 6th of February 1685 and the 11th of December 1688. James was an oldish man of 51 when he reached the throne. He was also a Catholic and immediately started trying to make things better for English Catholics, making English Protestants a little nervous. In response, English Protestants invited James's daughter Mary and her Protestant husband, William of Orange, over from Europe to take the throne instead. James II was the second son of Charles I and the younger brother of Charles II. Although he was a Catholic, no one really kicked up a fuss. After all, James can't have forgotten what happened to his father when Parliament didn't get their way. But James was no pushover. He told Parliament that the best way to engage me, to meet you often, is to use me well. He started trying to make life better for Catholics in England, and the Protestants thought that this meant a big Catholic takeover was planned. People started to get upset. Charles II's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, made a rebellious grab for the throne, but this was brutally crushed. After this, a worried James II started promoting Catholic friends to high positions. What came next was the final blow. James's second and Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, a Catholic heir to the throne. Now the Protestants were sure they were in trouble. The Protestants had a plan. They invited William of Orange, a Dutch prince who had married James's eldest daughter Mary, to sail across to England and take over. William was more than happy to oblige. The king actually had a bigger army than William, but when the Dutch arrived he completely lost his nerve and ran away. No one even needed to fight. Parliament decided that the king running away was as good as giving up the throne. Aside from one doomed attempt to re-invade via Ireland, James spent the rest of his life in exile in France, dying in 1701. James was no stranger to warfare. First he fought for the French against the Spanish, and then he fought for the Spanish against the French. When he returned to England following the restoration of his brother, Charles II, to the throne, he commanded the British Royal Navy very effectively. Not many other kings have fought in the armies of 3 different countries. He was so good at fighting that he was put in charge of firefighting during the Great Fire of London. James II's Protestant enemies were so suspicious of the king and his Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, that when the Queen gave birth to a little baby, they claimed the child was a fake, an impostor who had been smuggled into the bedroom in a warming pan. Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today we are doing a 5th look at this lovely Kings and Queens app from the Royal Collection Trust. Last time we finished with James II, and today we look at William George wasn't exactly a huge hit with the English people. He didn't really want to spend time in England, and he didn't seem all that keen on learning English. His coronation service was carried out in Latin because George understood more of the language of the ancient Romans than of the English. The Jacobites, supporters of James II, thought that this might be their chance to make a comeback. Unfortunately for them, the new king squashed their rebellion and successfully continued to squash the series of Jacobite and foreign attempts to overthrow his rule. Surprisingly, the biggest threat to George's reign came not from the Jacobites, but from the world of finance. In 1719, people started to get very excited about a company called the South Sea Company, and thought that investing in it was a guaranteed way to make them rich. Well, of course, nothing is guaranteed to make you rich, and when the South Sea Company fell to pieces in 1720, many people, rich and poor, lost an awful lot of money. Angry and ruined, they looked for someone to blame, and George and his ministers seemed as good as anyone. Luckily for George, a clever minister called Robert Walpole stepped in and did his best to sort out the mess, and the king managed to steer clear of the scandal. George I died in 1727 on one of his many trips back to Hanover. In 1682, when he was still in Hanover, George Louis married his cousin, Sophia Dorothea Avencelin. They had 2 children together, one of whom was the future George II. But George Louis found out his wife had been having an affair with a Swedish count. It didn't seem to matter to anyone that George himself had children with another woman. This was outrageous. Suspiciously, the Swedish count very soon went missing. Some sources say he was murdered and thrown into the river, others that his body was later found hidden under palace floorboards. Sophia was divorced and imprisoned, never to walk free or see her children again. After George Louis had imprisoned his wife, little Prince George never saw his mother again, and relations between father and son became increasingly unfriendly. In fact, Prince George grew to hate his father. Then, to make matters much worse, George I decided to take away his son's children, only letting them see their parents once a week. It was a cruel and unnecessary thing to do, and it did him no favours with the British public. It may seem strange, but perhaps George I's crowning achievement as king was letting Parliament take increasing control. His lack of English language skills meant that he had to rely on his ministers to help manage affairs of state. After a while, he even stopped going to cabinet meetings and let the government make decisions without him. His reign saw the first real Prime Minister of Britain, Sir Robert Walpole, take charge. Now we go on to George II. George II lived between the 30th of October 1683 and the 25th of October 1760. He reigned between the 11th of June 1727 and the 25th of October 1760. Despite tensions between him and his father, George II was pretty similar to George I. He was initially rather unpopular, but then he went to war and defeated the French at the head of the English army, the last British monarch to lead troops into battle. George then completely wiped out the Jacobite rebellion, led by Prince Charlie, after which business without always trying to take charge. The year after his accession, George married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, an affectionate match that would produce 15 children. He bought Buckingham House, later Buckingham Palace, as a home for his ever-growing family. At that time it sat on the very edge of London, surrounded by open green fields. George was a good and faithful husband to Queen Charlotte, never taking any mistresses. However, he was so horrified by the behaviour of his brothers, who kept getting married secretly, as did George's eldest son, that he insisted on a Royal Marriages Act, which meant that the monarch had the right to prevent any marriage of the descendants of George II. The Royal Marriages Act was still in place up until 2013. However, now it only applies to the first 6 people in line to the throne. It's rather a shame, really, that the things for which George III are most often remembered are American independence and the King's Year of Madness, when the story of his 60-year reign contains so much more. George III was a man of culture. He started a royal collection of books. 65,000 of these were later given to the British Museum. Founded and paid for the Royal Academy of Arts, which still exists today, and had his own astronomical laboratory. He was so interested in science that he bought his own scientific instruments, many of which you can now see in the Science Museum in London. As if all this wasn't enough, he even found time to be interested in farming, especially at Windsor Castle, which earned him the nickname Farmer George. George III was the victim of an illness, which has subsequently been suggested may have been porphyria. That began in 1788. At this time the king was found talking to an oak tree in Windsor Park, believing that he was in conversation with the King of Prussia. George recovered at first, but would be plagued by illness over the final decades of his life. This meant that, at times, he was unfit to rule, and power had to be passed to his son, who became the Prince Regent, or ruling prince. Eventually the king suffered a period of illness from which he would not recover, spending his final years in confusion at Windsor Castle. Very sad end for a thoughtful and dedicated ruler. Now we go on to George IV. George IV lived between the 12th of August 1762 and the 26th of June 1830, and he reigned between the 29th of January 1820 and the 26th of June 1830. Unlike his well-behaved father, George IV was a king of the old Stuart mould. He loved to have a roaring good time. He grew fat on fine food and wine, and his only exercise was chasing women. George IV was enormous. He reportedly ate 2 pigeons and 3 steaks every day for breakfast, washed down with a few glasses of alcohol. He wore a corset in an attempt to streamline his figure, but he pushed his fat up into double chins. So he also started a fashion for high collars in order to disguise these. One of the top artists of the day, Sir David Wilkie, claimed that George looked like a great sausage. George IV didn't care much for his dad's Royal Marriages Act. In 1785 he secretly married a twice widowed Roman Catholic, Maria Anne Fitzherbert, in her living room. George and Maria's relationship was off and on for the rest of his life, but in 1795 George III refused to pay the prince's debts unless he married his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. The marriage was a disaster from day one. Caroline was horrified by the width of her future husband's waist, and George claimed that Caroline was ugly. He got drunk before the marriage ceremony, and as soon as it was over, did his very best to avoid his new wife. They managed to have one child together, a daughter named Charlotte, before going their separate ways. Caroline was barred from George's coronation, but insisted on showing up anyway, trying to force her way in. The doors were slammed in her face. Later, George would put his estranged wife on trial for adultery. Just because he didn't want her didn't mean she should be available to anyone else. George IV may have become an extravagant spender, but it wasn't all for nothing. He purchased some incredibly important works of art, which are now in the royal collection, transformed Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace, and built the Royal Pavilion of Brighton. He commissioned the architect John Nash not only for work on the palace, but also to design Regent Street and Regent's Park in London, along with Oxford Circus and Piccadilly Circus. And so that ends this section. Next, we will begin with William IV, the Sailor King. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers saying, I shall see you very, very soon. Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and this is the final part of my Kings and Queens videos. Now we're on William IV, the Sailor King. William IV lived between the 21st of August 1765 and the 20th of June 1837, and he reigned between the 26th of June 1830 and the 20th of June 1837. William was a sailor, not a ruler. At least that's what he thought. His unexpected accession to the throne didn't change his down-to-earth personality, and after years of extravagance under George IV, Britain breathed a sigh of relief. William was the opposite of his over-the-top brother, even trying to give away Buckingham Palace. He didn't have any children of his own, but made sure he lived long enough to hand the crown straight to his beloved niece, Victoria. William was a sailor and is the younger son of George III. He had no expectation of ever becoming king. He joined the Navy aged 13 and spent most of his youth sailing around the Caribbean. He might well have stayed there, but fate had other ideas. First, George III became increasingly unwell, and power passed to William's brother conditions came from the party supported by the king. However, the king came under huge pressure from the public to agree to the bill, and he finally did the right thing and let it through. Not before plenty of people had noticed his reluctance, however. William was already quite old when he became king, and so it's hardly surprising that it wasn't a long reign. But he vowed to live until his niece and heir, Victoria, turned 18. He hung on to life and didn't die until 2 months after Victoria's 18th birthday, leaving a smooth succession. From 1791 to 1811, William IV lived with an actress called Dorothea Jordan. They were a happy couple and had 10 children together, the Fitzclarences. The prince couldn't marry Dorothea because of his father's Royal Marriages Act, but he also felt no need to go chasing after a royal wife because he was so far away from inheriting the crown. Eventually, William left Dorothea, marrying Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen some years later. Poor Dorothea ended up dying in poverty in France in 1816. At half his age, Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen might have been forgiven for being unenthusiastic about her new husband, William IV. Instead, however, she embraced her new life as his wife, sorting out William's debts, reforming his bad habits, and even welcoming his illegitimate children into their home. Sadly, Adelaide was not to have any children of her own, but she would continue to be a fond and loyal wife to William until his death, and an affectionate aunt to Victoria afterwards. Now we are gone to Victoria. Queen Victoria lived between the 24th of May 1819 and the 22nd of January 1901. She reigned between the 20th of June 1837 and the 22nd of January 1901. Victoria was crowned queen when she was just 18 years old. 3 years later, she married Albert, Prince of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, who played a vital role in supporting her until his untimely death at the age of 42. Victoria reigned from 1837 to 1901, the longest reigning monarch until our present Queen Elizabeth II. Now, of course, we now have King Charles, and Queen Elizabeth II is our former Queen. 6th of May 1910. Edward was the eldest son of Victoria and Prince Albert. Despite his strict upbringing as a young man, he proved difficult to control, was involved in a number of scandals. He was 59 when he came to the throne in 1901 and reigned for only 9 years. Although he was criticised for his affairs and mistresses, he was a skilled politician on the European stage and played an active role in encouraging military and naval reforms. Edward, christened Albert Edward, married Alexandra of Denmark. Edward VII was a pleasure-loving monarch, which at times brought his reputation into question. However, he was also a strong and effective leader, determined to modernise the royal court and to forge new bonds between Britain and the other countries of Europe. Edward VII was a great contrast to his elderly mother. He redecorated Buckingham Palace. He entertained there on a grand scale. He also greatly enjoyed travelling abroad, kept a stable of racehorses, and was generally a man of fashion and a bon vivant. Edward VII was a gifted linguist and an authority on foreign affairs, and brought about the signing of the Entente Cordiale in 1903. This was an agreement between Britain and France that the two countries would not interfere with each other's interests in Egypt and Morocco, respectively. In 1908, the king secured a coalition between Britain and Russia during a trip to visit his nephew-in-law, Tsar Nicholas II. These newly formed alliances meant that Britain had the support of France and Russia in any conflict with Germany, Austria or Italy. They earned Edward the nickname of Edward the Peacemaker and played a very important role in determining Britain's allies in World War I. Edward VII was involved in a number of scandalous love affairs from a young age. 6 years into his marriage to Alexandra of Denmark, he became involved in a very public divorce between a Conservative Member of Parliament and his wife, who claimed that the young prince had been one of her lovers. Now we go on to George V. George V lived between the 3rd of June 1865 and the 20th of January 1936. He reigned between the 6th of May 1910 and the 20th of January 1936. George V was a dedicated son and brother, a devoted family man, and the father of 6 children. He had a gruff, straightforward persona in the public's eye, and was much liked by his subjects. George V reigned during the years of World War I. During this period, the king made over 450 visits to troops and over 300 visits to hospitals for wounded servicemen. As the second-born son, George was not expecting nor raised to become king, and as a young man seemed set for a career in the navy. But after the death of his elder brother, Albert Victor, he became second in line to the throne after his father Edward. On his brother's death in 1892, George retired from his naval duties. The time he had spent in active service had created a man with a level-headed view on life, unusual option was not supported by the Prime Minister or by Parliament. The only option remaining was to renounce the throne, allowing his younger brother to take up the title of king in December 1936. Edward signed a document signifying his abdication. Now we go on to George the Sixth. George the Sixth lived between the 14th of December 1895 and the 6th of February 1952. He reigned between the 11th of December 1936 and the 6th of February 1952. George VI was the younger son of George V and wasn't in line to be king. When his older brother, Edward VIII, abdicated in 1936, Albert Frederick Arthur, George came to the throne. He ruled throughout World War II when he and his wife, Elizabeth, showed fighting spirit by staying in London during all the bombing, even being bombed in Buckingham Palace. Not expecting to inherit the throne, George VI, christened as Albert and known as Bertie in his days as a prince, entered the Royal Navy in 1913 and fought in World War I. Despite his surprise succession, George VI demonstrated himself to be a conscientious and dedicated monarch. Reserved by nature and with a deep religious belief, he was supported devotedly by his wife, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who he had married in 1923. George VI and Queen Elizabeth had two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. Elizabeth succeeded her father as Queen Elizabeth II. In 1920, the future George VI met, for the first time since childhood, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the youngest daughter of the Earl and Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn. He was determined to marry her even though she rejected the first two of his proposals. However, it was third time lucky. They were married on the 26th of April 1923 in Westminster Abbey. George VI's marriage to someone not of royal birth was considered a modernising gesture. During the first ever royal tour of Canada and the USA in 1939, the royal couple strengthened ties between Britain and North America. The trip was a triumph and boosted support for Britain in the US in the face of the looming threat of war with Germany. During the war itself, the royal family's refusal to leave travelled to more than 3,500 Acts of Parliament and held audiences with 12 different Prime Ministers. I think that's probably 13 now. The Queen is patron of over 600 charities and organisations, has conferred over 404,500 honours and awards, and held over 610 investitures. She was a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. She was born in 1926. She grew up with her younger sister Margaret. She became heir to the throne after the abdication crisis of 1936, and from an early age showed the same dedication to the realm that characterised her mother and father. She married Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten at the age of 21, and just 5 years later, in 1952, became Queen. At the age of 26, she was the youngest monarch to have served since Queen Victoria was crowned at the age of 18 in 1837. The Queen reigned through more than 6 decades of enormous social change. Man has walked on the moon, the Berlin Wall has been built and then razed to the ground, the Cold War has come and gone, and arguably is back again. Television and the internet have become a commonplace. As monarch, she travelled more widely than was possible for any previous king or queen, declaring on one tour to Australia and New Zealand that the crown is not merely an abstract symbol for unity, but a personal and living bond between you and me. She created and defined the position of a modern constitutional monarch. On the 9th of September 2015, Elizabeth II